Cold doesn't start by killing you. It begins by peeling away everything that makes you human. Dignity, hope, the memory of warmth. When Oakhaven cast Cora Higgins into the frozen maze of whispering pines, they weren't simply removing a problem. They were signing a death warrant in ice. But the wilderness that was meant to destroy her did something else entirely. It remade her. The stench of scorched grain and blackened timber still clung to the October air, thick, almost sweet, the kind of sweetness that turns your stomach. Oakhaven's communal grain store, the single artery feeding the isolated mountain settlement through winter, had been reduced to a shallow crater of pale ash and charred posts. Less than 4 weeks until the first real freeze, half the town's provisions gone in a single night. And frightened people don't look for answers. They look for someone to punish. Cora Higgins stood dead center in the muddy town square. Autumn wind snapped her tangled auburn hair against her cheeks. 24 years old, no family since her father died 2 winters back. Fiercely, stubbornly, self-reliant. Now, ringed by the contorted faces of neighbors she'd known since birth. "I didn't do it." Her voice came out shredded, raw from the smoke she'd swallowed the night before, trying to fight the blaze with her bare hands. Mayor Thomas Ellis stood elevated on the meeting hall steps, staring down at her with a face that offered nothing. He was a calculating man, a practical one. He understood something simple. If the town's fury found its way to him, to his failure to build a stone silo, to his negligence, the result would be chaos. He needed a body to throw to the crowd. "Because you were angry, Cora." Mayor Ellis's voice crashed across the square, bouncing off clapboard storefronts. Cora screamed, wrenching against the coarse rope biting into her wrists. Then, Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from the crowd, the baker's daughter. A heavy wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes skipped away from Cora's gaze, then locked onto the mayor. __quote _5 __, Sarah said. The words came out shaking, rehearsed terror dressed as spontaneous confession. __quote _6 __. The blood drained from Cora's face. Betrayal hit her chest like a fist. She knew exactly why Sarah was lying. 2 days earlier, Cora had caught her hauling sacks of flour from the storehouse, hoarding for her own family while others went measured. Cora had threatened to report her to the mayor, so Sarah struck first. Burned the storehouse to ash, erasing any evidence of theft. And framed the only person who could expose her. "Sarah, tell the truth," Cora begged, straining against the thick grip of Arthur Pendleton, the town's broad-shouldered sheriff, who pinned her arms behind her back. Reverend Miller's voice split the crowd's murmur like an axe through kindling. Banishment. The word dropped into the freezing air and just hung there, heavier than any snowfall. Banishment in late October meant one thing. The whispering pines, hundreds of miles of dense, ancient boreal forest, a sprawling, lightless labyrinth with no trails, no shelter, no mercy. Not exile, execution by cold. They moved fast, no time to gather belongings. They didn't even let her step inside her own cabin. Arthur Pendleton pulled the heavy winter coat from her shoulders and tossed it into the mud. Community resources, they said, not hers anymore. She stood in a flannel shirt, worn denim trousers, leather boots. Nothing else. Then, at the final moment, Arthur's hand found her pocket. a flicker of something human behind his eyes. He slipped in her late father's hunting knife, a small flint striker alongside it. "May God have mercy on your soul, Cora," Arthur muttered, barely audible, shoving her past the heavy timber gates of the village palisade. Because the winter won't. The gates crashed shut behind her. The iron bar dropped into its cradle with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Cora Higgins, severed from every living soul she'd ever known. She stood at the tree line, shaking hard, watching the sun slide behind serrated mountain ridges. The shadows of ancient pines reached toward her, long, dark, deliberate. Silence pressed in from every direction, total, suffocating. Panic rose in her throat, sharp and metallic. She looked back at the tall wooden walls of Oakhaven. She caught the distant murmur of voices, the clink of metal on metal, the rhythm of a life that had sealed its doors against her. Tears threatened. She crushed them back. Frozen eyelashes would blind her. Wasted moisture would kill her faster. "Stay here, and I'm dead before dawn." Her father's training surged up through her like groundwater. Cora turned her back on Oakhaven and stepped into the dark, gaping throat of whispering pines. The first 48 hours collapsed into a single smear of raw physical agony and mental torment. Temperature cratered below freezing the instant the sun dropped. She walked until her legs turned to iron, driven by one animal imperative: shelter before frost. She found it on the second afternoon, a natural limestone overhang at the foot of a steep ravine, half blocked from the wind by a tangle of deadfall. She spent hours hauling dry pine needles, dead leaves and moss into that crevice, banking them deep, a crude mattress to separate her body from stone that would leach every degree of warmth she had left. Her first fire was a war. Her hands were rigid, knuckles split and weeping in the brittle air. She peeled birch bark into tissue-thin curls, struck flint against the spine of her hunting knife. Sparks arced through the dark ravine. Died. Again. Died. She wept, tears crystallizing on her cheeks. Quote 13. A voice hissed inside her skull. Quote 14. Quote 15. Cora rasped into the emptiness. The words sounded alien, scraped hollow. Quote 16. She struck again, full body behind the blow. A spark held. Birch bark hissed. A thread of grey smoke curled upward. She dropped to her knees, cupped herself around that ember-like armor, fed it breath. Slow, steady, gentle. The glow spread. Red deepened. And then a single, perfect flame licked upward. She gave it twigs, then branches, until a roaring fire shoved the darkness back like a fist. Cross-legged before that blaze, her body convulsing as heat soaked into frozen marrow, Cora Higgins made a vow without sound. Whispering pines would not claim her. She would survive. And Oakhaven would learn the cost of throwing a woman to the wolves. The first month in those woods remade her entirely. The frightened girl, shoved through the village gates, died somewhere in the first week. What replaced her was leaner, harder, savage in its insistence on living. Hunger became a permanent resident behind her ribs. The forest in late autumn was closing down, sealing itself for deep winter. For 2 weeks, Cora survived on a starvation ration. She stripped shriveled rose hips from thorny stems, boiled pine needles in a hollowed chunk of hardwood, bitter tea that held scurvy at bay, cracked open rotting logs for pale, fat grubs. They tasted of soil and bile. She forced them down, knowing each calorie was another second on the clock. She understood quickly that the limestone overhang when true blizzards arrived. She needed real shelter. Armed with nothing but her father's hunting knife and bare hands, Cora began excavating a dugout. She chose a steep, south-facing dirt bank to catch whatever thin warmth the winter sun offered. 10 brutal days of digging. She gouged frozen earth with sharpened sticks, scraped soil loose with flat stones. Her fingernails cracked and bled. Every muscle howled. She didn't stop. When the hole was deep enough to stand in, she started felling saplings. Hours to hack through a single trunk with a 6-inch blade. She laid them across the dugout's mouth, wove them tight with supple willow. Over that wooden skeleton, she heaped 2 feet of pine boughs, dead leaves, then a dense layer of mud and raw earth. It froze solid by morning, an airtight, insulated shell. She shaped a narrow entrance, sealed it with a woven mat of pine branches. Inside, she carved a shallow fire pit and angled a chimney tunnel up through the dirt bank. Smoke out. Heat trapped underground. The first fire she lit inside that dugout changed everything. The temperature climbed. The space was small, thick with the smell of earth and pine resin. But it was warm. It was hers. But warmth without food is just a comfortable place to die. Cora picked apart the fraying edges of her flannel shirt, twisting those stubborn cotton threads into crude snares. She'd watched her father build them 100 times, but watching and doing share almost nothing. She placed them along game trails. Then she waited. 4 days passed. Every snare came up empty. Her strength drained away, hour by hour. Sleep stretched longer each time. The will to drag herself from that warm dugout into the knifing cold. It thinned to almost nothing. On the 5th morning, a sharp squeal split the silence of the forest. Cora clawed her way up the embankment, boots skidding on frost-slick moss. There it was, a big snowshoe hare, thrashing wild, caught by the throat in her makeshift loop. She didn't pause. Pity was a currency she couldn't spend. One quick snap of the neck, a whispered thanks to the forest. That night, she turned the meat slowly over her small fire. Rich, fatty protein flooding her mouth. It hit like a sacrament. She kept every bone for broth, scraped the pelt clean, stretched it across a wooden frame to cure. She wasn't just clinging to life anymore. She was learning its language. 3 weeks deep into exile, the forest handed her something she hadn't earned. Cora had pushed into a ravine she'd never explored, hunting for late-season mushrooms. Wind tore through the upper canopy, screaming of an early storm. She picked her way down a steep, rocky grade, and the ground vanished beneath her boots. She crashed down slope, slamming into a heap of rotten, snow-crusted timber at the bottom. Spitting dirt, she wiped her face and studied what had caught her. Not just deadfall, a collapsed lean-to. An old trapper's camp, abandoned God knows how many seasons back. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She tore into the wreckage with both hands. The wood was spongy, rotted through, crumbling at her touch. Under a canvas tarp that fell apart like wet paper, her fingers closed around something heavy and rust-caked. A hatchet. The handle was split. The iron head wore a thick skin of orange corrosion. But beneath that rust, an edge. Still there, still real. To Cora, it outweighed a solid brick of gold. Her hands trembled as she kept digging. A heavy cast-iron skillet emerged, a dented tin cup, and then a full spool of thick copper snare wire. Cora slumped against the ravine wall, pressed the hatchet to her chest, and made a sound caught somewhere between laughter and weeping. The equation had just rewritten itself. Over the following days, she worked a smooth riverstone across the hatchet head, grinding away rust, honing the blade until it threw back light with a killing gleam. Firewood that once took hours now fell in minutes. She shored up her dugout walls, dropped heavier trees, built a proper drying rack for meat, and hung a solid wooden door where the flimsy pine mat had been. The copper wire gave her dozens of traps: rabbits, squirrels, a fat grouse. She began stockpiling, smoking strips of meat over hardwood coals to hold through the weeks ahead. Bone needles and twisted sinew turned pelts into thick mittens, a lined hat, a heavy fur vest. The frail cast-off from Oakhaven was gone. What moved through whispering pines now was something closer to its apex predator. But the forest had only been letting her believe she was winning. It came on a late November afternoon. The sky, clear, piercing blue all morning, bruised over to the color of hammered iron. Temperature dropped so fast, Cora felt moisture crystallize inside her nostrils. A thick, smothering silence pressed down on the woods. No birdsong, no branch moving. Nothing. Cora stood at the mouth of her dugout, face tilted toward that dead sky. She'd seen this before, back in the village. The signature of a whiteout. A monstrous blizzard capable of burying the world under feet of snow in hours. Temperatures crashing to 40 below zero. "Come on, then," she whispered upward, pulling her fur collar tight against her throat. Her eyes were steady, sharp, already calculating. "Show me what you've got." The next hour was pure controlled fury, hauling armload after armload of split firewood into the dugout, packing every gap, filling every spare inch with fuel. She hauled the frozen meat inside, drove the heavy timber door shut behind her, and dropped the thick crossbeam into its cradle. Darkness swallowed her. Outside, the first flakes drifted down, gentle, almost tender. Within minutes, that tenderness became violence. Snow screamed sideways in horizontal sheets. Wind clawed at the earth above her dugout like something starving. True winter had arrived. Its purpose was simple: erase anything too weak to endure. Deep below ground, Cora Higgins fed her fire. Flames flickered in her eyes. She was warm. She was fed. She was alive. As the storm tore at the world above, her thoughts drifted toward Mayor Thomas Ellis, toward Sarah Jenkins, toward all of Oakhaven. They had thrown her out, expecting death to finish the job, trusting their village walls like a prayer. But Cora understood what they refused to see. Their grain store was ash. A storm this brutal, hitting a town with empty reserves. Those people behind their sturdy walls were the ones in true danger now. Winter had come, and the balance was shifting. The blizzard howled for 4 brutal days. Inside her underground chamber, time dissolved. Cora tracked the hours by 2 measures only: the shrinking woodpile and the hollow ache in her gut. She rationed the smoked meat savagely, gnawing small, leathery strips of rabbit jerky to stretch what remained. Above her, the wind didn't blow. It shrieked, a metallic, high-frequency wail that vibrated through frozen soil and lodged in her molars. When that shrieking finally died on the fifth morning, silence replaced it. Not ordinary quiet, a silence with weight. Cora lifted the crossbeam and shoved the door. It refused to move. Panic, instant, blade sharp, stabbed through her ribs. Buried alive. She seized her wooden shovel and attacked the narrow ventilation shaft, cracking away packed ice until one blinding lance of sunlight split the darkness. 2 hours of brutal digging followed. 4 feet of compacted snow carved at an angle before she broke through the crust and dragged herself into open air. Whispering Pines was gone. In its place, a white ocean. Endless, blinding, featureless. The brooding dark forest had vanished beneath drifts. Temperature sat easily at 30 below zero, but overhead the sky burned crystalline blue. Not a single cloud. Cora strapped on the crude snowshoes she'd woven from willow and sinew during the storm's captivity. Her snare lines needed checking. The blizzard would have forced animals into shelter, and she desperately needed fresh fat to rebuild her reserves. She was 2 miles out, crossing a ridge above a frozen creek bed, when she spotted it. A flash of crimson. Unnatural. Violent against the white canvas. Cora dropped low, hand falling to the hatchet at her belt. She waited, watched her breath hang in the frozen air. Nothing moved. She advanced slowly, snowshoes crunching against the crust. The crimson shape sharpened. A torn scrap of wool, snagged on a splintered pine branch. Beneath that branch, half swallowed by a drift, a large mound. A few swift kicks cleared the powder. A frozen boot appeared. Then a leg in coarse denim. She fell to her knees, clawing with mittened hands, and uncovered 2 ice-crusted faces. The first, a boy. 17 at most. Lips a horrifying blue, eyes shut. She knew him immediately. Toby Jenkins, Sarah's younger brother. Beside him, beard frozen solid to his chest, Sheriff Arthur Pendleton. Neither responded. Both had sunk into the final lethal phase of hypothermia. An hour remained, maybe less. Then their hearts would simply stop. Leave them. The feral, hardened voice inside her spoke clearly. They belong to the town that sentenced you to die. Let the forest collect its due. She stared at Arthur Pendleton's rigid, frost-bitten hand. She remembered the weight of her father's hunting knife sliding into her pocket on Exile Day. That quiet act of treason, that small, forbidden mercy, had kept her alive. Cora swore out loud. Her voice cracked the pristine silence like glass. She could not leave them. If she let the cold strip away her compassion, then Oakhaven had already killed the woman she once was. Something worse than death. Moving with desperate speed, she hacked thick pine boughs and lashed together a rough travois. She dragged the unconscious men onto the frame, binding them down with her copper wire. She seized the drag ropes and drove forward, letting her thighs absorb the punishment. 250 pounds of dead weight through hip-deep snow, pure, grinding agony. Every fiber in her legs shredded. Her lungs took in air like broken glass. But she never once stopped moving. By the time she reached the dugout, the sun had already slipped beneath the horizon. The snowfields glowed in sick purples and deep, angry oranges. She hauled them down into the earth-warm dark of her shelter, peeled the frozen clothing off their rigid bodies, wrapped them in the thickest furs she owned. Then She fed the fire until that small underground room became a furnace. She melted snow in a pot, threw in dried herbs and the last of her fatty grouse meat, and worked drops of scalding broth past their cracked lips. 12 hours of constant care passed before Arthur finally opened his eyes. He stared at the dirt ceiling, then the fire, then the wild, fur-clad woman working a cast-iron skillet. "Am I in hell?" Arthur rasped, his voice a dry croak. "No," Cora replied, steady and hard. "You're in my house." Over 3 days, as Arthur and Toby clawed their strength back, the truth about Oakhaven bled out into that warm, earthy air. The village was dying. The blizzard had buried it whole, and without the communal grain, starvation arrived with ruthless speed. But the cold wasn't the real poison. The mayor was. Thomas Ellis had declared martial law. He'd seized every remaining private food cache, claimed it was equitable rationing. In truth, he was stockpiling for himself and his loyal council dogs. "Sarah broke," Toby whispered one evening, tears carving lines through the soot on his face. "When the mayor slashed our family's rations to a quarter loaf a day, the guilt ate her alive. She stood up in the meeting hall and confessed everything. She told them she'd burned the storehouse to hide her own theft. She told them you were innocent." Cora felt something hollow open in her chest. Vindication, but the cold kind. "And the mayor?" "He locked her away," Arthur said, bitter, wrapping blistered hands around a tin cup of hot tea. "Called her hysterical from hunger. He knew the moment he admitted he'd exiled an innocent woman, the town would hang him from a rafter. Toby and I slipped out to hunt. Thought we could go around the mayor entirely. The storm caught us instead." Arthur's gaze swept the dugout. Dried meats hanging from the ceiling, stacked furs, the sheer, undeniable competence of the place. Of her. Cora said nothing for a long time. Firelight moved across her scarred, weather-hardened face. She had carved a kingdom from dirt, built it with pain and solitude. She owed Oakhaven nothing but ash, yet letting innocent people starve under a tyrant's boot, that was a cruelty she could no longer carry. "Rest up," Cora said. A command, not a suggestion. "Tomorrow, we load the sled." The march back took 2 brutal days. Cora broke trail in snowshoes, compacting powder, dragging a massive sled heaped with hundreds of pounds of smoked rabbit, grouse, frozen fish, thick pelts. Arthur and Toby, still frail, followed behind, walking the path her body carved through the wilderness.